Welcome to StoriesX. A high-end boutique humiliated Michelle Obama, treating her like she didn't belong. But when she returned, the shock that followed changed everything. What happened next exposed a deeper truth about power, prejudice, and the silent barriers in elite spaces. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to StoriesX and hit the notification bell so you never miss the stories that matter most. Let's get started. The sun was just beginning to rise over the bustling streets of Manhattan, its light reflecting off the glass skyscrapers that lined the avenues. Morning commuters hurried along the sidewalks, their footsteps echoing in rhythmic unison as taxis honked and vendors called out their wares. Amid the city's energy, nestled between high-end cafes and luxury boutiques, stood an establishment that seemed to exude an almost ethereal exclusivity. Its name, embossed in gold on a sleek black plaque, was synonymous with prestige and unattainable luxury. Inside the boutique, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Marble floors stretched out in every direction, reflecting the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. The scent of expensive candles lingered in the air, subtle but intentional, an invisible marker of wealth. Mannequins stood like sentinels, draped in garments that could fund a year of college tuition. The staff moved gracefully, their every step rehearsed, their voices hushed to match the reverence of the space. This was not a place for browsing. It was a sanctuary for the ultra-rich, a temple to consumerism. Near the entrance, a pair of sales associates stood behind a glass counter displaying diamond-encrusted jewelry. Their tailored uniforms and polished appearances radiated a practiced perfection. One of them, a man in his early 30s, leaned slightly toward the other, lowering his voice just enough to maintain the illusion of professionalism. "Did you see the new shipment? That emerald clutch, absolutely breathtaking," he murmured, his tone dripping with curated enthusiasm. "Only 3 in the world," his colleague replied with a knowing smirk. "I've already got 2 appointments lined up. Can you imagine someone just walking in off the street and asking for it?" They shared a quiet chuckle, the kind reserved for those who believe themselves above reproach. Just then, the boutique's door opened with a soft chime, interrupting their conversation. Heads turned instinctively, as they always did when someone entered. The figure that stepped inside, however, did not fit the archetype of their usual clientele. She wore a simple gray cardigan over a white blouse, paired with comfortable jeans and a pair of worn sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her only accessory was a practical leather tote slung over one shoulder. Michelle Obama had come in search of a gift. The former First Lady moved with a quiet confidence, her presence commanding attention despite her understated appearance. She glanced around the boutique, taking in the displays with the same thoughtful consideration she brought to any public space. Yet, instead of the warm reception she might have expected, she was met with a palpable chill. The man behind the counter narrowed his eyes slightly, masking his judgment behind a polite facade. To him, she was an anomaly, a woman who did not belong. He exchanged a quick glance with his colleague before stepping forward to intercept her. His smile was polite, but there was an edge to it, like a blade hidden in velvet. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Can I help you with something today?" Michelle smiled graciously, oblivious, or perhaps choosing to ignore, the subtle condescension in his tone. "Good morning. I'm looking for a special gift, something elegant but meaningful, perhaps a handbag or a piece of jewelry." The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting to her shoes before snapping back to her face. "Of course," he said smoothly, though his smile tightened. "Our collection is very exclusive. Most of our pieces are one of a kind. May I ask what sort of budget you're working with?" The question, though seemingly innocuous, carried an undercurrent of doubt. Michelle's expression didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of the barriers she'd faced so many times before. "I prefer to see the collection first," she replied evenly, maintaining her poise. "Then we can discuss specifics." "Of course," the man repeated, but his tone had shifted. As she moved past him, He cast a glance toward his colleague, who raised an eyebrow in silent communication. Michelle began to browse, her eyes scanning the displays with genuine interest. She paused in front of a glass case, housing a series of handbags, each more ornate than the last. One in particular caught her attention, a sleek design in emerald green leather with gold accents. It was both striking and timeless, the kind of piece that could make a statement without shouting. "This one," she said, gesturing to the bag. "May I see it?" The man who had greeted her stepped forward, his movements deliberate. He unlocked the case with a key and carefully removed the bag, placing it on the counter in front of her. As he did, another employee approached, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a clipboard in hand. She surveyed Michelle with a quick, appraising glance before whispering something to her colleague. "Ah," the man said, his tone shifting. "I should mention, this particular piece is from our limited edition collection. It's priced at $75,000. The number hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, Michelle wondered if he expected her to recoil. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. "It's beautiful," she said. "What else can you tell me about it?" The man hesitated, caught off guard by her composure. Before he could respond, the woman with the clipboard interjected. "It's a favorite among our long-standing clients," she said, her voice tinged with a sweetness that felt insincere. "We usually reserve it for appointments. Were you referred to us by someone?" Michelle turned to face her, her gaze steady. "No," she replied simply. "I walked in." The woman's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "I see," she said, her tone cool. "Well, we're happy to assist you. Just keep in mind that our inventory moves quickly, and most of our clients prefer to finalize purchases immediately." There was again the assumption, the unspoken dismissal cloaked in civility. Michelle felt a familiar heat rising in her chest, a mix of frustration and determination. She had come here for a simple purpose, yet she was being tested, her worthiness evaluated by people who knew nothing about her. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the lessons her parents had instilled in her: grace under pressure, dignity in the face of disrespect. For now, she would let it go. But something told her this encounter was far from over. Michelle continued her quiet exploration of the boutique, her gaze trailing over the meticulously arranged displays. Each item seemed to demand attention, from the shimmering necklaces to the delicately stitched leather handbags. The air was heavy with an unspoken rule. Everything in this space was meant to awe, to dazzle, to intimidate. Yet, as she moved between the vitrines, the unease in the room grew more palpable. The sales staff were watching her now, their gazes barely veiled behind professional smiles and hushed conversations. She paused near a stand of scarves, her fingers brushing lightly against the silk fabric of a vibrant hand-painted piece. The texture was exquisite, the craftsmanship undeniable. Michelle admired the artistry for a moment before glancing up, only to catch one of the sales associates whispering to her colleague. They exchanged a subtle laugh and quickly turned away, pretending to straighten the display. Michelle's smile tightened, but she refused to react. Years in the public, I had taught her the art of composure, and she wasn't about to falter now. Still, their laughter lingered like an unpleasant echo in the back of her mind. She moved toward the counter, where the emerald handbag still rested, its gold clasp gleaming under the soft lights. The male associate, the one who had greeted her earlier, returned to her side. His smile was practiced, but his eyes betrayed his thoughts, an unmistakable judgment. He gestured toward the handbag with a theatrical flourish, as if presenting it to a royal court. "Have you decided, ma'am?" he asked, his tone laced with false courtesy. "It's a unique piece, truly one of a kind." "It's beautiful," Michelle replied, her voice steady. "Could you tell me more about its design and craftsmanship?" The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, clearly unprepared for her interest in the specifics. "Well," he began, fumbling slightly, "it's handcrafted in Italy. The leather is sourced from a family-owned tannery that has been in operation for centuries. The gold hardware is exclusive. I'm sure, Michelle finished, her tone neutral but pointed. She let her gaze linger on his face, watching him squirm under her calm scrutiny. Precisely, he said, recovering quickly. We only offer such pieces to clients who truly appreciate their value. May I ask if you'd like to proceed with a purchase today? Michelle caught the faint emphasis on the word today, a subtle insinuation that her interest might not translate into action. Before she could respond, the female associate with the clipboard approached, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Her expression was polite but distant, as though she were addressing a wayward guest at an exclusive event. "Excuse me," the woman said, glancing at her colleague before turning to Michelle. "I just want to ensure that you're aware of our policies. Items from this collection are reserved for clientele with established purchase histories. It helps us maintain the exclusivity of our brand." The words were delivered with a disarming smile, but their intent was clear. Michelle felt the heat rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. She met the woman's gaze directly, refusing to look away. "I see," Michelle said slowly. "And what exactly does an established purchase history entail?" The woman hesitated, clearly unprepared for the question. "It's just a way of ensuring that our clients are aligned with the brand's values and standards," she said, her tone growing more strained. Michelle's calm facade remained intact, but inside, her frustration was mounting. She had faced countless subtle and not-so-subtle instances of discrimination in her life, but each one stung anew. She thought about the young people she had mentored, the stories they had shared of being judged unfairly because of how they looked or where they came from. This moment, she realized, was no different. "I'd like to see the bag again," she said, her voice firm. "If it's not too much trouble." The male associate, clearly uncomfortable, exchanged a quick glance with the woman before reaching for the bag. He placed it on the counter in front of Michelle, his movements overly cautious, as if he feared she might damage it simply by proximity. Michelle studied the bag closely, her fingers tracing the fine stitching along the edges. She wasn't thinking about the price tag, or even the practicality of the item anymore. What mattered now was standing her ground, refusing to be dismissed. She turned to the man, her expression calm but unyielding. "I'll take it," she said. The words hung in the air, silencing the faint murmur of conversations nearby. The male associate blinked, clearly caught off guard. The woman with the clipboard raised an eyebrow, her polite mask slipping for a moment before she quickly recovered. "Of course," the man said, forcing a smile. "Let me prepare the paperwork for you." He turned and walked toward the back counter, but Michelle could feel the weight of their judgment pressing against her like a tangible force. The whispers started again, low and furtive, but she caught fragments of their conversation. "Is she serious?" one voice said. "She doesn't look like she can afford it," another replied. Michelle clenched her jaw, her patience wearing thin. She had come here for something simple, a gift, a moment of quiet joy in a place where she should have felt welcome. Instead, she was being scrutinized, judged, and belittled. The male associate returned, holding a clipboard with a form clipped neatly to the top. "If you could just provide some information," he said, his tone overly sweet. "We'll also need a credit check before finalizing the purchase." Michelle stared at him, her expression hardening. A credit check? In all her years, she had never been subjected to such a demand. It was an insult, thinly veiled as policy. "I don't think that will be necessary," she said coldly. The man hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Before he could respond, the woman with the clipboard stepped forward again, her voice dripping with faint concern. "We simply want to ensure a smooth transaction," she said. "You understand, I'm sure." Michelle's composure finally cracked, though only slightly. Her voice was calm, but there was steel in her tone. "What I understand," she said, "is that you've made an assumption about me based on nothing more than how I look. That's not policy. That's prejudice." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment, the tension in the room was almost suffocating. Then, the male associate cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Perhaps we should," he began. But Michelle didn't let him finish. "I think I've seen enough," she said, straightening her shoulders. She turned on her heel and walked toward the exit, her steps deliberate and measured. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, but she didn't look back. As the boutique's door closed behind her, the cool air of the city rushed over her, washing away some of the tension. But the sting of their judgment lingered, sharp and unforgiving. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The streets of Manhattan buzzed with their usual frenetic energy. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional shout from a street vendor, the rhythmic footsteps of pedestrians moving with purpose. It was a stark contrast to the sterile silence inside the boutique. Michelle stood just outside the door, collecting herself, trying to calm the swirling storm of emotions churning within her. She had faced public challenges, endured harsh criticism, and even stood up to world leaders. But there was something uniquely insidious about this type of subtle, socially sanctioned discrimination. It felt particularly dehumanizing. She inhaled deeply, letting the cool air steady her. Then, she turned on her heel and stepped back through the boutique's doors. This time, she wasn't walking in as a customer. She was walking in as a force of reckoning. The door chimed softly as it closed behind her. Several heads turned in her direction, as they always did when someone entered. But this time, the reaction was different. The sales associates, some of whom had laughed at her earlier, paused in their tasks, their eyes following her, their expressions a mix of curiosity, surprise, and in some cases irritation. Michelle moved with purpose, her head held high, her eyes scanning the room until they settled on the male associate who had served her earlier. He seemed momentarily stunned by her return. His eyes widened slightly before he quickly masked his reaction behind a practiced smile. He started to move towards her, but before he could reach her, Michelle spoke. Her voice rang out across the boutique, firm and clear. "I want to speak with the manager." The male associate hesitated. The color drained from his face. He glanced toward the back of the store, where the female associate with the clipboard stood frozen, watching. Her expression was unreadable, but Michelle could see the tension and the stiffness of her posture. The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her smile forced. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Michelle turned to face her, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, there's a problem." Her words were measured, but the weight behind them was undeniable. "The way I was treated here today was completely unacceptable. I came in looking to make a purchase, but instead, I was subjected to scrutiny and disrespect that I would not expect anywhere, let alone in a place that claims to value its clients." The woman blinked, clearly taken aback by Michelle's directness. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for support from her colleagues. Several other sales associates had stopped what they were doing, their attention fixed on the confrontation unfolding before them. The air seemed to grow heavier, the tension almost palpable. "I assure you, ma'am, we have policies in place to ensure that our clients receive the best possible service," the woman began, her voice strained. "We have to maintain certain standards." Michelle cut her off, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Standards that apparently include making assumptions about people based on their appearance? Tell me, what about me suggested that I wasn't worthy of being treated with respect?" The female associate opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her carefully curated professionalism crumbled under Michelle's unwavering gaze. She looked to her colleague for help. The male associate, the one who had asked Michelle for a credit check, took a few cautious steps back, as if trying to distance himself from the situation. "Perhaps it would be better if you left, ma'am," the woman finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michelle raised an eyebrow. A small, incredulous smile tugged at her lips. "You want me to leave?" she asked, her tone disbelieving. She took a step forward, her presence seeming to fill the space around her. Is this how you handle situations when your staff mistreats someone? By asking the victim to leave? The woman flinched at the word victim. Her composure cracked further. She glanced around, clearly uncomfortable, her eyes pleading silently for someone to step in and take control. But no one moved. The rest of the staff remained frozen, caught between curiosity and fear. The male associate finally spoke up, his voice tense. "We don't want any trouble." He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering to the other customers who were now watching intently, some with raised eyebrows, others whispering behind their hands. "We have other customers to serve, and this isn't the type of environment we want to foster." Michelle let out a short laugh, the sound filled with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "You think I'm the one causing trouble?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "All I wanted was to make a purchase, but instead, I was made to feel as though I was trespassing, like I wasn't good enough to even step foot in this place." The boutique grew silent. The female associate cleared her throat, clearly attempting to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. Michelle shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowing. "That's not what this is about, and you know it." She took another step forward. "You didn't refuse me service because I was causing trouble. You refused me service because of your own assumptions, because I don't fit your idea of what a worthy client looks like." The tension in the room was electric. Finally, the female associate seemed to snap, her face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She took a step forward, her voice rising in frustration. "Please leave, ma'am. We don't need a scene here." Michelle looked at her, her eyes filled with a calm defiance that seemed to unsettle the other woman. She held the associate's gaze for a long moment before finally nodding, her lips curving into a tight smile. "Fine," she said, her voice low but firm. She turned toward the exit, but before she left, she cast one final glance over her shoulder, sweeping the room with her gaze, taking in the stunned faces of the staff and the wide-eyed expressions of the other customers. "But know this isn't over." She paused at the door, her voice carrying through the boutique with quiet power. "You can't keep treating people like this and expect no consequences. The world is watching, and people deserve to know how they'll be treated when they walk through these doors." Then, without another word, she pushed open the door. The chime rang softly as she stepped back onto the bustling streets of Manhattan. Outside, the cool air rushed to meet her, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere she had just left behind. She paused, closing her eyes, inhaling deeply. The pain and frustration she felt were familiar, but that didn't make them any easier to bear. She had faced prejudice before, more times than she cared to remember, but the sting of being dismissed and judged so casually still left a bitter taste in her mouth. And this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and typed a quick message to a trusted contact. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever walked into a space and been made to feel like they didn't belong. And it was time the world heard about it. Michelle sat in the back seat of the black SUV, her phone resting in her palm, her mind racing with thoughts. The boutique was behind her, but the weight of what had happened still lingered. She had faced discrimination before, covert, subtle, wrapped in the guise of policies and protocols. But this time, she wasn't going to let it pass in silence. She pulled out her phone and began typing a message. It was a simple text sent to a trusted journalist. "Call me when you're free. I have a story you'll want to hear." Within minutes, her phone buzzed. "Michelle?" The voice on the other end belonged to Vanessa Carter, a respected investigative journalist and longtime advocate for racial and social justice. "What's going on?" Michelle exhaled sharply. "I need to expose something. I just had an experience at a boutique that speaks to a much larger issue. I walked in to buy a gift, but instead, I was dismissed, belittled, and ultimately told to leave because I didn't fit their idea of a proper customer. Vanessa was silent for a beat before responding. Say no more. Let's talk in person. That evening, Michelle met with Vanessa and a small group of trusted individuals, activists, journalists, and legal experts. They gathered in a quiet corner of a hotel suite, the soft glow of city lights flickering through the windows. Michelle recounted everything that had happened, her voice steady, her expression resolute. When she finished, Vanessa leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. This isn't just about one boutique, Michelle. This is about an entire culture that thrives on exclusion while hiding behind luxury branding. Another journalist, Malik Anderson, nodded. We need to shine a light on this. The kind of discrimination you faced isn't new, but when someone like you speaks out, it forces people to listen. We can do something with this, something bigger than just calling out one store. Michelle folded her arms. I want to go back. The room went silent. I want to go back, but not alone. I want this film. I want people to see what happens when businesses like these think they can decide who belongs. Vanessa exchanged glances with Malik before nodding. We'll set it up. We'll be discreet, but we'll make sure the world sees what's really happening inside those doors. The plan was in motion. 2 days later, Michelle found herself standing in front of the boutique once again. But this time, she wasn't alone. A small but powerful team had assembled. Journalists, activists, and even a discreet film crew prepared to document everything. The air was thick with anticipation. The city's usual hum of activity momentarily drowned out by the energy of the moment. As Michelle stepped forward, cameras discreetly positioned to capture the encounter, she felt the weight of the past few days settle onto her shoulders. This was no longer just about a handbag or a rude sales associate. It was about standing up to a system that thrived on exclusion. The boutique's doors opened with the same delicate chime, but this time, the staff's reaction was starkly different. The moment Michelle stepped inside, recognition flashed across their faces, followed quickly by panic. The woman with the clipboard, the one who had smugly dismissed her days before, stood frozen. The male associate who had questioned whether she could afford the bag visibly paled. The realization hit them all at once. She had come back, and she had brought the world with her. Michelle walked through the store with the same quiet confidence as before, but this time, there was an undeniable shift in power. She wasn't just a potential customer anymore. She was a reckoning. She approached the counter, her voice steady and firm. I was here 2 days ago. I was disrespected, judged, and ultimately asked to leave because you assumed I didn't belong. I want to know, what's different today? The female associate's eyes darted around, her lips pressing into a thin line. I think there may have been a misunderstanding. Michelle arched a brow. Oh, a misunderstanding? Interesting, because when I was here last, your message was very clear. The male associate stepped forward, attempting to salvage the moment. Mrs. Obama, we truly apologize if there was any miscommunication. We value all of our customers. Michelle cut him off. That's the thing you don't. You value a certain type of customer. You cater to people who look and dress a certain way. And if someone doesn't fit your mold, you dismiss them. Let's not pretend this was an accident. The air in the boutique grew suffocatingly still. A camera flash flickered from outside. The crowd that had gathered was growing. Bystanders peered through the windows, their phones lifted, recording the moment in real time. One of the journalists accompanying Michelle spoke up, her voice cool and professional. We're here today because this isn't an isolated incident. It's a systemic issue in luxury retail. Do you think your boutique represents an inclusive environment? Because from what we've seen, it doesn't. The female associate swallowed hard, her posture rigid. We have policies in place to ensure exclusivity. It's what our clients expect. Michelle tilted her head slightly, her tone razor-sharp. Exclusivity is one thing. Discrimination is another. The fact that I was treated as a lesser customer, despite being willing and able to purchase something, proves that the lines you've drawn aren't about wealth. They're about who you think deserves to be here. The boutique staff exchanged nervous glances. Outside, the murmurs of the growing crowd grew louder. People were taking notice. Michelle took a step closer to the counter, lowering her voice so only the staff could hear. You have a choice right now. You can either continue to uphold outdated, discriminatory practices, or you can start making real changes. But know this, people are watching. They will remember. The female associate's jaw clenched. For the first time, she seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. The world was indeed watching. We'll need to speak with management. Her voice was noticeably shaken. Perhaps we can discuss some adjustments to our policies. Michelle held her gaze. Good, because I plan to make sure you follow through. She turned to the cameras, her voice strong and unwavering. This isn't just about one boutique. It's about every person who has ever walked into a space and been made to feel like they didn't belong. This is about calling out the quiet prejudices that exist in these so-called elite spaces. The world is changing, and it's time businesses change with it. The crowd outside erupted into applause. Without another word, Michelle turned on her heel and walked out, leaving behind a boutique that would never be the same. The video of Michelle's return to the boutique spread like wildfire. Within hours, news outlets picked it up. Within days, it was being discussed on morning talk shows, late-night panels, and social media platforms across the globe. Clips of Michelle standing firm, questioning the boutique's discriminatory policies, and refusing to back down were replayed over and over. The moment she walked out, leaving the boutique scrambling for damage control, became an instant symbol of resilience. Hashtags like #RespectInRetail, #EqualityForAll, and #MichelleSpeaksTruth trended worldwide. For the first time, the luxury industry, one that had long thrived on exclusivity at the cost of inclusivity, was being forced to reckon with a truth that had hidden behind gilded doors for decades. But this wasn't just about a boutique anymore. This was about every person who had ever been humiliated, overlooked, or dismissed simply because they didn't look like they belonged. Inside the boutique's corporate office, a crisis was unfolding. The executive team scrambled to contain the damage. They had expected a minor PR hiccup, something they could smooth over with a generic apology. But this was an avalanche. A flood of negative reviews appeared overnight. Customers who had once frequented the boutique shared their own experiences of being dismissed or treated unfairly. High-profile figures, celebrities, influencers, and even other former first ladies began speaking out. Some canceled collaborations. Others vowed to stop shopping at stores that engaged in exclusionary practices. Luxury, it seemed, was being redefined. Finally, after days of silence, the boutique released a formal statement. We sincerely regret the unfortunate experience Mrs. Obama faced in our store. We recognize the need for immediate change in how we engage with our customers, and we are committed to implementing diversity training and reevaluating our internal policies. We apologize and will take concrete steps toward a more inclusive shopping experience. It was a carefully worded corporate statement, polished and precise, but it wasn't enough. The public demanded action, not just words. And Michelle wasn't done yet. Sitting in her home office, Michelle scrolled through the thousands of messages pouring into her inbox. Some were from supporters, thanking her for standing up. Others shared their own painful experiences of being ignored or treated differently in high-end stores, restaurants, and even workplaces. She realized something. This wasn't just a moment. This was a movement waiting to happen. Barack entered the room, leaning against the doorway, watching her. You're planning something, aren't you? Michelle exhaled, nodding. This can't end with a press release. People have been dealing with this for too long. If the store really wants to make a change, then they need to do more than just train their employees. They need to open their doors to everyone. Barack crossed his arms, smiling knowingly. And how do you plan on making that happen? Michelle leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp with determination. We take it public, a national conversation. Not just about the store, but about systemic bias in high-end spaces. She picked up her phone and dialed Vanessa Carter, the journalist who had helped her orchestrate her return to the boutique. Let's organize a town hall. A week later, a virtual town hall was broadcast live, hosted by one of the country's biggest networks. It featured Michelle as the keynote speaker, alongside activists, business leaders, and everyday people who had faced discrimination in retail. The conversation was raw and unfiltered. A young black woman spoke about being followed by security while shopping for a dress for her graduation. A Latino man shared how, despite wearing a tailored suit, he had been asked to prove he could afford a watch before the clerk would even show it to him. An older woman recalled how, even with a platinum credit card, she had been ignored in favor of younger, wealthier-looking clients. Their voices painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Michelle listened intently, her expression filled with both sorrow and determination. When it was finally her turn to speak, she leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. For too long, we've accepted this kind of treatment as just the way things are. But the way things are isn't the way they should be. No one should ever feel invisible. No one should ever be judged by the color of their skin, the clothes they wear, or their perceived status. She paused, her voice steady but impassioned. This isn't about canceling businesses. This is about pushing them to be better, to do better, because respect should never be a privilege. It should be a given. The response was immediate. By the next morning, the town hall had been viewed over 20 million times. Retailers, fashion houses, and CEOs took notice. Some issued statements. Others, fearing backlash, quickly announced new diversity and inclusion initiatives. But Michelle didn't just want promises. She wanted accountability. And so, she took the next step. Using the momentum, Michelle launched the Inclusivity in Retail Initiative, a coalition of businesses, activists, and consumers committed to holding luxury brands accountable. Her goals were clear: mandatory bias training for all employees in high-end retail, transparency reports on customer service practices, a rating system for businesses based on inclusivity, and to ensure it had teeth, she partnered with some of the biggest names in business, companies that were ready to lead the change instead of reacting to it. Within months, the initiative had gained traction. Stores that had once thrived on exclusivity realized that if they didn't evolve, they would be left behind. It wasn't about breaking down luxury. It was about redefining it. Because true luxury, Michelle believed, wasn't just about price tags and status. It was about making everyone feel valued. Months later, Michelle found herself back in Manhattan. As she walked past the same boutique that had dismissed her, she noticed something different. A new sign was displayed in the window. All are welcome here. She smiled to herself. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a complete fix. But it was a start. A step toward a world where no one had to prove they belonged. And that, she thought, was worth every second of the fight. In the end, this wasn't just about a handbag or a single moment inside a boutique. It was about the quiet prejudices that still exist in places meant to welcome all, but often only serve a select few. Michelle Obama turned an act of exclusion into a movement for change, proving that when we speak up, we force the world to listen. This story is a reminder that respect should never be a privilege. It should be a given. No one should have to prove their worth just to be treated with dignity. Whether in high-end boutiques or everyday life, we all have a responsibility to challenge discrimination wherever we see it. What do you think? Have you ever faced a moment like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more powerful stories. Together, we can make a difference.